If you have listeners telling you that they love your podcast, but your downloads aren't growing and no one's joining your email list and absolutely no one has bought anything from you and sponsors haven't reached out and said, hey, I would love to sponsor your show, this is the episode for you. I'm going to walk you through how to figure out where your podcast is losing people and, more importantly, what to fix first so that your show can get found by more listeners, keep them coming back, and actually move them to action. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Something that I do here on the podcast, in case you haven't noticed, is that I treat every episode like a standalone episode, meaning that you don't have to technically listen to the one before it or after it for that episode that you're listening to right then and there to make sense. Now, there are episodes, of course, that are certainly related, but every episode is meant to deliver value in its own right, so that if you just listen to that episode, you'd still walk away with value. And if you have an educational podcast, you need to be doing the same, because think about it. If a listener is finding you for the first time, yes, of course, we want them to listen to other episodes in our catalog, but in order to get them to do that, the episode that they listen to has to actually deliver value. Why am I telling you this? Because this is one of those times and one of those episodes that is the exception to the rule. And I definitely recommend at some point that you listen to the episode right before this one, because it's going to teach you how to evaluate your podcast to see how it's doing right now in terms of converting cold listeners to new listeners. So people who don't know you yet to people who have actually clicked play on your podcast for the first time, and then converting those new listeners to loyal listeners, people who come back for more and listen again. And most importantly, converting those loyal listeners to email list subscribers or to clients or to customers or to people who buy from your sponsors and or through your affiliate links. And without knowing your podcast's conversion rates, you're going to waste a lot of time fixing things on your podcast that might not actually be broken. And I see it all the time. We have clients that'll come to us and they'll say, Courtney, I think I need to change the name of my podcast. And I'm like, hold on a minute. Why do we need to change the name of your podcast? Well, my show just isn't growing and I'm just, the downloads have stagnated. I feel like I'm not going anywhere with my show. And I'm like, all right, hold on a minute. Let's take a look at how your podcast packaging, your podcast content gatekeepers, all the written messaging that a listener sees before they hit play, how is that converting right now? And in some cases, it's really amazing to see, well, you know what? You don't need to change the name of your podcast because your name is doing a great job at converting new listeners. The breakdown is happening somewhere else in your podcast funnel. Now, on the flip side, sometimes we look at the numbers and we say, yeah, actually, these numbers should be a bit higher. We would like to see them higher, and that might have to do with the messaging of your podcasts. So knowing your podcast's conversion rates can really help you pinpoint with accuracy where you need to focus and where you need to focus your time and your energy and your attention. Because if your conversion rates are all good and your podcast still isn't growing, that's not a podcast problem. That's a traffic problem. I would tell you, we need to get out and run some marketing campaigns for your podcast. If your conversion rates are below average or below the baseline for your show where they need to be, I'd tell you, hey, let's fix the pieces of your podcast first to get it converting better. Then we'll go out and get it in front of more people. Because if you try to drive traffic to a podcast that's not already converting well, it's not going to make your podcast convert better. You'll still have a podcast that doesn't convert well, and you'll miss out on new listeners who might have converted had you fixed those issues in the first place. So knowing your baseline conversion rates helps you to know what to fix and what's working well and doesn't need fixing. So when I say conversion rates, now I'm not just talking about your lead conversion or sales conversion rates. There are 3 podcast-specific conversion rates that you as the host need to know about your podcast. In the episode before this one, I broke down exactly how to find them, and I walk you through exactly where to look to calculate where your baselines need to be. So whether you listen to that episode now and then come back to this one, or listen to this one first and then go listen to that one, I don't care. I just care that you listen to it, okay? Because being the host of a podcast, it's kind of like being a pilot on an airplane. If you want that plane to take off and fly, you got to understand what all the little dials and buttons mean inside the cockpit and which ones to touch and which ones to leave be and when to adjust them and so on. But what I typically see with most podcasters is that they have the plane, they've got the podcast, and they have the cockpit. They've got their analytics dashboard between their hosting provider and Spotify and Apple, but they're still sitting on the tarmac staring at all the buttons and the dials because they have no idea what they mean. So they can never get that plane off the ground. And some of them at some point just abandon their plane altogether and they leave it sitting there and try to find another way to reach their destination, i.e. audience growth or whatever that destination might be, not realizing that their plane, again, their podcast, is one of the most effective ways to travel if only you know how to fly it. Because unlike a real plane where you are the passenger, In the plane that is your podcast, you are the pilot. And honestly, that is one of the essential requirements of podcast growth is you as the host have to equip yourself with the know-how to get your plane off the ground and to get it flying and to keep it flying. And then that is where podcasting gets really fun. I mean, remember your first flight. If you've ever been on an airplane, I remember when I was 4 years old going on an airplane and it was like that moment when the plane takes off the ground is like nothing you've ever felt before. And I remember flying with my now 7-year-old for the first time. This was a few years ago. Same kind of thing. It was that same reaction. It's a feeling you never forget. That feeling is what every podcaster wants. That feeling is also really difficult to achieve as a podcast host if you, as the host/pilot, don't know how to fly the plane. Which brings me to what we're talking about here, which is how to fix your podcast conversion rates if they're not performing at the level that they should be, which again, I teach you how to figure out in that episode before this one. Just because we're not diving into detail on that doesn't mean that I'm leaving you hanging there or kind of skirting around that, okay? It's all broken down in that episode right before this. So just to recap, those 3 podcast conversion rates are from cold listener to new listener. This is your new listener conversion rate. From new listener to loyal repeat listener. This is your retention conversion rate. And from loyal repeat listener to lead or buyer. And this is the conversion rate most people tend to think about when you hear the term quote unquote podcast conversions. But there's actually 3 of them. Okay. So know in your funnel how listeners are converting and moving down your podcast funnel. So before we get into the nitty gritty of what to fix and what to look at and what to tweak, I want to let you know I have a very, very easy way for you to evaluate all the things that I'm about to mention. It's free. It takes about 15 minutes, and it's going to give you a custom report with exact next steps to focus on for your show, as if I sat down and audited your podcast for you. Okay, more on that in a minute. But first, let's look at what to do for each of these conversion rates if they are underperforming. And I want you to know that if your conversion rates are performing below the baseline, where the baseline needs to be for your show, this is not bad news. This does not mean your podcast is doomed. This does not mean your plane will never fly. It actually is a good thing because it indicates that there is something there. It's an opportunity for us to fix. There's something we can optimize for, which is great. And this actually brings a lot of energy because it brings a lot of clarity. So if your cold to new listener conversion metric is underperforming, this tells us we need to optimize your podcast packaging, your podcast content gatekeepers. This is all the written messaging of your podcast, anything a listener encounters on your show before they decide whether or not to hit play. Now, we are optimizing this not for your existing listeners who already know you and love you. We are optimizing this for new listeners who don't know you yet. Your podcast title, your cover art, your podcast description, your episode titles, and your episode descriptions, because these are going to be the things that convince someone to click play or not when they see your show in the lineup of all the other shows teaching something similar to you that they can choose from. And so most podcast hosts think about content. But if you want to get more listeners listening to your content, you got to get them to that content. You have to sell them on why they should hit play in the first place. So these podcast content gatekeepers are all designed to get listeners to hit play, to move a person from someone who has no idea who you are, but who just found your podcast in their feed, to someone who actually hits play on your content and gives your episodes a chance. I have a lot of episodes on how to optimize your podcast content gatekeeper, so I'm going to drop a few of them in the show notes for you. Plus, like I mentioned, I've got that very easy way for you to laser in and assess exactly how your gatekeepers are performing right now. So no need to overthink this one. Just head to the show notes. You're going to see the links there to learn how to optimize these different aspects of your podcast to get more listeners clicking into and clicking on your show. And you'll also see the link there to take the podcast health assessment, which again, I promise I'm not just teasing here for fun. I will go into more detail about this, but I want to give you the good stuff first. And so you'll see the link there too. You can take that assessment and it will give you a report of how your gatekeepers are performing and what you need to do to optimize. But a few things that you will want to do at a minimum is first and foremost, analyze your competition. When's the last time you have looked at your competition? Have you ever looked at your competition? Who else is in your podcast category right now teaching what you teach? If you looked at your podcast next to your top competitor's podcast, would it be immediately obvious to a listener why they should choose yours? Now, I know you might be a little biased towards your show, but if your answer is, well, I don't know, or I think so, or I'm not sure, we have work to do. Because if a listener sees your show as one option on a menu of many shows to choose from, what's going to make them choose yours? That is what your podcast content gatekeepers have to communicate. Most people don't take the time to do this work. And they hope for the best. And then they wonder, why is my podcast not growing? And interestingly, at this point, we here at Pod Launch have relaunched as many podcasts as we've launched new for the first time, which is kind of ironic because the whole name of the company is Pod Launch, right? But it just, the stuff that we talk about here on the show is not common knowledge in the industry. Yet yet. Okay, we're changing that. So if you listen to this show, you are ahead of the game. Now, the second thing that you want to do is to pressure test your messaging for clarity. I don't mean look at your messaging and decide for yourself if it's good. No. I don't mean ask your friends and family if they like your podcast name or if there's anything that they would improve. Spoiler alert, they're all going to tell you, I love your show. And they're going to give you absolutely nothing constructive to go on. Plus, they're biased towards you. They already know you, they like you, they trust you, and they have some general sense of what you teach and why you teach it. I definitely do not mean go put your show into ChatGPT and say, hey, ChatGPT, does this messaging resonate? Is this good? Does it stand out? First of all, GPT has a bias toward people pleasing. I don't know if you've noticed this, but if you type something in to ChatGPT, ChatGPT is actually a people pleaser at heart. Seriously, I don't know about you, but I have put some things in there that are absolutely terrible. And it'll come back and it'll say like, wow, this is really insightful. I love how you're thinking about this. Here's what I would recommend. And then lo and behold, what it recommends is, guess what? No surprise here, something that sounds totally and utterly generic, like AI wrote it. Because if you want to stand out, you can't sound like AI. Okay, we're not going to go on an AI tangent, but if you've heard me rant on AI before, then you know. And if you know, you know. AI is going to make you sound generic unless you have developed your core messaging first and then trained AI on your core messaging. A lot of podcast hosts and a lot of people in general, frankly, go to ChatGPT or these other AI tools thinking that it will sound better than what you have actually written. But if you want your podcast messaging to stand out, you can't use AI to create it. You've got to develop your core messaging first and then train AI on that messaging, at which point it can help you speed up the process of creating additional messaging. But core messaging has to come from you. Why? Because it comes from within. And it takes time to test and refine it. I have been refining the messaging around this show for well over 2 years now. So refining, though, let me be clear, does not mean changing your messaging every other month. It doesn't mean changing your title of your podcast and changing up the description and changing it. It means listening to the market, listening to your listener, listening to the people that you interact with. If you have a business behind the podcast, who are the leads you sit down with on calls? Who are the clients that you interact with? Knowing that they're always going to have a little bit of a bias towards you because they understand, they have more context for the work that you do in the world, but always working to identify what are the problems that they came to you for help to solve, because this is going to help you clarify and distill your message so that it's immediately clear who you're here to help and what you're here to help that person do. Because now that person is your listener who right now is out there having that problem that they need your help to solve, but they just don't know about you yet. So if you really want to pressure test your messaging, go anonymously into some Reddit forums. I know Reddit is a scary place, but this is what you're going to do. You're going to go into Reddit. You're going to find some subreddits on your specific topic, filled with people who are interested in your specific topic. And then, without giving any context, no context whatsoever for what your show name means or why you chose it, I want you to drop your podcast title in there and ask people for their opinion. Literally say, give me your opinion on this podcast title. I want to know the first impression that this title makes and whether it's a show you listen to. Period. And drop the title. Do not say anything else. Even if you have already launched your show, I want you to do this. You're going to get some useful third-party feedback. And if someone gives you some constructive feedback or if they say something kind of mean or whatever, don't try to defend it. Don't be like, this is my podcast and I think it's an amazing name. No, just take the feedback and then utilize that to your advantage. Utilize that to help you refine your messaging. Even better, you can just take the free podcast health score that I keep teasing here, which I promise I'm going to tell you more about. But this is the whole reason I built this, so that you can easily assess how your messaging is performing right now and what to do if it's not as strong as you thought that it was. And it's free, okay? So the link's going to be in the show notes below. But there are a lot of things you can look at. With our clients, look, I will tell you this, frankly and transparently, we spend anywhere from 1 to 3 months. 3 months. Developing the messaging of their podcast before their launch or relaunch. This is before we build a marketing plan for the show. This is before we build a monetization plan for the show. This is before anything else. But these first couple things that I mentioned here will get you moving in the right direction. So let's take a look then at the next conversion rate to optimize for. This is your new listener to loyal repeat listener conversion rate, or your retention conversion rate. This one is all about the content. And it has to do with the content itself, the delivery of your content, the host's personality, the editing quality, the built-in binge triggers that you have or don't have, your sequencing, your episode structuring. There's a lot here that you could optimize for. The good news is that if your conversion rate for this one is converting at or above your minimum baseline for your show, keep doing what you're doing. There is no need to spend time optimizing your content because it's performing well. If it ever did dip below the baseline, there are many things you could do. Again, that podcast health score assessment is going to give you specific next steps that you can take for your show. But as far as general steps, make sure that you are listening to the episode on binge-worthy content structure as soon as you finish this episode. Okay, I'll link to that in the show notes too, because no matter what type of podcast you have, educational, true crime, entertainment, I don't care what it is, having a specific structure within your content can help keep listeners listening from start to finish. I was on a call recently with Lindsey Graham, not the senator, the podcast host and the producer who's best known for American History Tellers and American Scandal and History Daily and a whole host of shows, no pun intended. And he went in depth about his episode structure. And he talked about how, the structure really, in part, helps create bingeability. And I'm like, oh my gosh, Lindsey, you're like speaking my language. It's so true, because not only does it help to create continuity across episodes, but it also helps your listener move through your content. Because at this point, this conversion rate, the action that you're driving to optimize for here, is getting listeners to listen as long as possible. Which is why if your conversion rate is below the baseline on this one, the first thing you could do, without even touching your content, is adjust the length of your episodes. Now, I'm not saying you have to go from 40 minutes to 10 minutes, but I am saying that if you have an average of a 30-minute episode and listeners are only getting through 60% of your content or 18 minutes, shortening your content from 30 to 22 minutes can help almost instantly. So again, there's a lot of nuance here. There's a lot that we could dig into, but without getting too deep into the weeds, I will tell you that our retention conversion rate jumped from 60% up to 80 to 90% without changing my content, just with adjusting the length of the episodes. And then from there, you can adjust your content. So again, the episode in the show notes and the podcast health score will help you figure out if your content needs to be optimized right now, and if so, how to do it. And then finally, the last of the 3 conversion rates is listener to lead or to buyer. This can take shape a number of ways. If you got a business behind the show, chances are you're driving people to your programs or your services. If you don't have a business behind the show, but you're looking to turn your podcast into a business, well, then you're going to be approaching sponsors and advertisers. In all cases, you want to be getting leads onto your email list, because regardless of if you've got a business behind your show or if your podcast is the business, that's going to help you expand your overall reach. This way, the overall perceived value of your show is higher, particularly when you approach a sponsor, because then you can pitch them not just the reach of your podcast, but your overall reach across platforms, including your email list. And arguably, having an engaged email list, honestly, is even more valuable than your podcast audience, because those are the people who have already raised their hand saying that they want more from you. So there's so much you can do with an email list. But optimizing people to take action from your podcast, like what do you want your listener to do next? This comes down to having a system on the back end that tracks your listener to lead conversions. The next step would be optimizing the calls to action you're giving in every episode, and then tracking those to see how they perform, and then making very targeted, specific adjustments from there based on where you're driving people. So again, my goal is not to get too in the weeds here, because this one especially is going to be specific podcast to podcast, but to give you clear first steps on what to look for and on what to optimize for based on where your podcast is currently performing. So my biggest recommendation to you, if you walk away with nothing else from this episode, is that I do not want you to go out there and try to fix all 3 of these conversion rates at once. First of all, it's just overwhelming. And second of all, it's analysis paralysis, because you're going to be like, oh my gosh, none of my conversion rates are performing the way that I need them to, or this one's almost there, but this one's not quite there. Which one do I focus on first? What I want you to focus on first, regardless of where your current podcast conversion rates are, is focus on converting new listeners to your show. We have got to optimize for that one first, because that is how you're going to grow your audience. Then we want to focus on keeping them listening. And those two go hand in hand, because again, we don't want to be driving traffic to a show that, it's converting well, it's getting those new listeners to click in, but then they're dropping off just as quickly because the content's not holding their attention. So these are 2 sides of a coin. Once we've got those really strong, then we can focus on driving those listeners elsewhere once you've built that listener loyalty onto your email list, turning them into customers, affiliate sponsor offers, and so forth. The other thing I want you to take away from this episode is that for each of these conversion rates, there is no quote unquote industry standard in terms of good. The podcast industry is not put out a report and say, you need to have a minimum of this for your podcast to be considered successful. No, all you were trying to do is beat your own baseline. This is not about what someone else is doing on their podcast. This is about, where does your show need to be? Are you hitting that baseline, and are you improving upon that baseline month over month? Because there is no apples to apples comparison in podcast land. Now, of course, if you want specific steps targeted for your show this is the part where I fill you in on this brand new state-of-the-art, industry-disrupting podcast health score that we have created for you. Dun, dun, dun. I'm so excited about this, though, seriously, because nothing in the industry exists like this right now. This health score is not just like a podcast quiz that you take that's going to give you like some surface level insight into your podcast. No, this is an assessment that is built on our proven pod launch methodology and backed by 36,000 hours and 12 years of collective study from our team into what separates top podcasts from the ones that go unnoticed. This is the first step towards standardizing the metrics in the industry that we need to be looking at, the metrics that drive podcast growth. So what this assessment does is it actually measures your podcast against these 5 core drivers of podcast growth. There's 5 sections, 5 simple questions in each. It'll take you no longer than 15 minutes to complete, but then boom, it's going to spit out a custom podcast audit report with very clear next steps on what to do for your show to optimize for each of those 5 sections. So you can find it at podcasthealthscore.com or just click the link in the show notes and then stay right where you are, because in the next episode, you're going to see how to optimize for these variables in real time as I walk one of our listeners through the ins and outs of how to set up a system to track her listener to lead conversions, help more listeners find her podcast, and some very easy, lesser known ways to start driving more traffic to your show. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.